Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. My special guest today is someone whom I think is very familiar to many people in the CTV audience. He's an educator, a businessman, author, motivational speaker, and as I indicated, he has his own program on CTV called The Thinking Mind, and his name is George Stern, Jr. George, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Phil. Always a pleasure to work with you.
Did I leave anything out?
That's fine, that's fine.
Okay. The title of your program is The Thinking Mind, and I find that to be a thought-provoking title. And one of the reasons for that is that the most famous words I think the Buddha ever spoke were the following. We are what we think. With our thoughts, we make the world. What's your take on the Buddha's saying?
Well, I think that is so true. We tend to be products of our thinking process. The words we use to describe what goes on around us impacts our thinking. And as you mentioned, as we think, we produce. And the challenge is that we have to keep working at improving our thinking skills, because thinking is a skill just like a lot of other things in life.
Yes.
But people don't view thinking as a skill. They just kind of assume that because they can think, they think well. Just as they assume that because they breathe, they can breathe well.
I very much agree with you. We don't assume that just because somebody plays the violin that he or she plays well. I took guitar lessons for some years. I was never a good guitar player, so one could not assume simply because I took lessons that I was good at it. And I think thinking is in the same category, that we can't assume that because we all think that all people think equally well. I very much agree with you. It is a skill. In one of your books, you quote the writer James Allen from his classic book entitled As a Man Thinketh. And I just want to read a short excerpt from one of your books in which you quote him and have you comment on this, because I think it's a very thought-provoking quotation. Each of us is the farmer of our mental garden. Each of us has the responsibility of keeping our mental gardens free from the weeds that can destroy and limit the beauty and happiness of our lives. Each of us is challenged to weed out those thoughts that are disruptive to our continual growth and development. I like the analogy between weeds and certain kinds of thoughts that we may have. What are some of the obstacles to thinking more clearly?
Well, I think today more than any other time in our history, we are bombarded with information. Some historians argue that there have been three major revolutions in civilization. One was the Agrarian Revolution, which started at about 8000 BC and went through about the middle 1700s AD. And that's when man learned to be able to harvest the land, to raise crops instead of having to roam and hunt for their food. And the second major revolution was the Industrial Revolution, which started in Europe about the 1750s and terminated probably in the mid-1950s. And then the third major revolution, which is we're just beginning that now, is the Information Revolution, which started about the 1950s and it will continue for God knows how long. The challenge with this information revolution is that the human mind is bombarded with so much information. The mind has not developed the skills to properly, in my estimation, analyze all this information.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to, when you talk about our mental gardens, it's very easy to have our mind contaminated with all kinds of information, which isn't helpful to us. It seems to me that in today's world, we have too shallow a thinking process. We are very impressed by what we see in terms of the 30-second sound bite or something that we may read in the newspaper or see on television, etc., without actually doing any kind of in-depth analysis. So consequently, while we obviously are able to think, it's the quality of our thinking. we've kind of gotten into a society where we are more feelings oriented. And it's much easier to feel your way into something than it is to think your way into something.
Yeah.
Because to think your way into something, you have to work at it. You have to go out and get information. You're not able to just get information from one source. You have to get it from multiple sources. Whereas feeling is very easy. How do you feel about this?
I agree with you. I think also one of the problems today that many people don't seem to be aware of, or at least not sufficiently aware of, is that there is a lot of manipulation in the media and elsewhere, whether it's politicians from the left or the right manipulating us, whether it's advertisers, corporations manipulating us. And if people aren't aware that they are being manipulated in one way or another, the consequences can be disastrous. One of the things I did when I taught high school many years ago is we took a couple of weeks each year to discuss the possible impact, negative and positive, of television and advertising. And one of the books all my students had to read, and these were juniors in high school, was a book called The Hidden Persuaders by Vance Packard. It was a book about the advertising industry and how it worked. This goes back to maybe the 1950s and 60s when it was written. I was teaching this in the 1960s. But my point is that so many of the students were fascinated by some of the techniques, the psychological techniques that advertisers were using to get people to buy automobiles, perfume, furniture, houses, you name it. And I think that once they became more aware of the manipulative techniques, then they were better prepared to deal with them and less likely to be taken in by them. And I think the same thing would be true of politics. If people understood how both liberals and conservatives and even centrists try to manipulate people, they could better deal with it.
Sure, just a point, economics. You know, if they understood economics. A politician recently said that what we need to do is we need to tax the excess profits from the oil companies, addressing particularly Exxon. Now, you know, people could say, well, yeah, that's true, because they'll say, you know, this is, the oil companies are contributing to the increased price of gasoline. Well, the reality base is that if you take a look at Exxon and its performance, Exxon has a profit margin of about 10.6%, which means for every dollar of sales, they keep roughly 10 cents, a little more than 10 cents in net profit, which means 90 cents goes out in terms of expenses and costs, et cetera. Now, is that excessive? Well, according to the listing of the 500 largest U.S. corporations by Fortune magazine, which comes out every year in its May issue usually, there are 113 other corporations in that list of 500 that earn more in profits, percentage-wise, than Exxon.
Yeah.
So Exxon doesn't have excess profits. But if you understand economics, most of Exxon's business comes from Europe. Okay? So if the American government was to tax Exxon, what Exxon would simply do is take its gas and sell it in Europe.
What you're saying isn't simply relevant to economics, in my opinion. It's relevant to democracy.
Yes.
That we know that Thomas Jefferson believed that a democracy could not flourish if the citizenry remained very ignorant.
Exactly.
That he believed we needed a well-informed citizenry for democracy to work. And my own viewpoint is this, that democracy is not working today as well as it could or should, because the citizenry for various reasons, isn't well-informed. It could be laziness on the part of a lot of the citizens, and again, could be other reasons as well. But again, what you're saying it goes straight to the issue of government as well and democracy as well.
Yes, no question.
Yeah.
You know, again, I think part of the fact that we're in the beginning stages of this information revolution, and the average person is so overwhelmed with information, they don't know. It's kind of like if you go to a restaurant, there's a 100-page menu. I mean, how do you begin to take what you know?
Yeah.
So it's the same thing with information. But it's interesting you mentioned that, because the true foundation of a democracy is an educated population. And that's in the old days. I mean, they would go to the pub and they would have debates and discussions on substance. We don't do that here. We don't. These political debates, there's no substance. It's name calling, it's attacking, it's this,
Yes,
that, and the other
yes.
thing. And David McCullough, who I know you're familiar with.
Yeah, and I like David
Oh,
McCullough.
he's a brilliant, brilliant
In fact,
man.
I just recently saw a series he narrated on John Adams.
Yes. And of course, he wrote 1776, which is one of my favorite books. But he just gave a commencement address at Boston College on May 19th. And the theme of it was the importance of learning. And in it, he said, what has happened in our society is that we have confused information with learning. And that we teach information. And we confuse knowledge with learning. He said neither of these things are actual learning. I mean, because as far as information goes, I mean, you could just go to the internet and get information. That doesn't mean you've learned anything.
Yeah.
He talks about how real learning comes from reading great books.
Oh, I very much agree with that.
Reading wisdom, about wisdom, because wisdom doesn't change over time. Wisdom is timeless.
Yeah.
I mean, if you read Socrates, if you read Plato, and you read about the principles that have built, for example, America, those principles do not change over time. Trust, integrity, honesty, self-discipline, self-sacrifice, fairness, they're the same.
Yeah.
What changes are values, what we value. I mean, for example, what you and I value today may be different from what we valued 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and maybe different 5 years from now. So values change, but trust and integrity do not change.
What fascinates me about our society is that it seems to me many people think they already have wisdom and therefore don't seek it.
Exactly.
And I don't mean this in a pretentious way. I myself, if somebody would ask me, Phil, do you have wisdom? I would say, well, I think I'm wise about some things and foolish about others, meaning I have to continue to pursue wisdom.
Exactly.
Nobody's totally wise.
Exactly.
But again, it seems to me that so many people in our society assume they already have a lot of wisdom, and therefore there's no real reason why they should pursue wisdom by reading good books, by listening to informative programs, etc.
Just studying history.
Just studying history.
Because
I
it does
agree.
repeat itself.
Yeah.
You know, there's a great quote that said, good is the enemy of better. Once you feel you're good, you say, I don't have to work at it anymore, I'm good.
I'm so happy you mentioned history. And we both like quotes. We were talking about this before. Tolstoy had a
Yes.
great quotation about history. In fact, it's in War and Peace. He has a character say this: the aim of history is to teach humanity and nations to know themselves. The aim of history is to teach humanity and nations. One of the things I regret about my own high school education was when I took American history and world history. I don't recall any of my teachers, if we were studying slavery or the Holocaust or the Industrial Revolution or capitalism or communism, I don't recall any of my teachers saying, does this tell us anything about human nature? Because I think that kind of question can really turn kids on and get them to think, what is slavery? What perhaps might slavery tell us about human nature, or the Holocaust, or the Industrial Revolution, or capitalism, or communism? That if history is just presented as a collection of facts and dates, it's meaningless.
It's irrelevant. It's
That's
irrelevant.
information.
Exactly.
We want insights.
That's it.
We want insights.
That's exactly. Because what happens is, people attempt to take, for example, today's standards and today's thinking and make judgments on things that happened 200 years ago. How could you do that? I mean, you take a look at the Revolutionary period. I mean, the most populous state was Philadelphia, not Philly, but Pennsylvania. They had like 35,000 people. I mean, 35,000 people. I mean, look how many people we have on Staten Island. The world was a lot different then. So how can you use today's values and attempt to understand what happened then or during the Civil War or during World War I, World War II? It's not possible to do that. And we have to study the past to understand human nature, because human nature, what people like and how they react, it's not that much dissimilar in terms of the values and things or the principles.
We know that the ancient Greeks, perhaps most famous maxim was know thyself.
Yes.
That they believed that was the foundation of wisdom. And I believe that if we try to do that, if we try to increase our knowledge of ourselves, not only will it help us to deal with life better on an everyday basis, but it simply makes life more interesting.
Yes.
That I think if children and teenagers could be taught that when they cultivate their curiosity about human nature and life, that there's perhaps nothing more important to educate oneself about than human nature and life. What makes life valuable? What makes life a fulfilling experience? That, in my opinion, that's much more valuable than spending time watching so much of what's on television today, whether it's Deal or No Deal or America's Next Top Model.
Or Dr. Phil.
Or Dr.
Oprah.
Phil or whatever. Yeah, I don't deny there are some good programs on, but I think most of the programs on television are not going to help people grow intellectually and emotionally. And that's the most important kind of growth we can experience.
Just,
Go ahead,
I could
please.
just touch base
Yes.
with what you said about this know thyself concept. That is a lifelong process, because I don't really think we could ever really know ourselves. It's constantly evolving.
Sure.
And it evolves from the experiences we have, whether those experiences are real life experiences or they're experiences we get from reading a great book or reading about history, because then we can kind of put things in better perspectives. And I think we as human beings are put here to grow, to make a contribution, to add value by simply our being here. Now, whether that value is just to do it for maybe another person or a few people or a large number of people, but it's in the process of adding value, I think, that gives life its meaning.
You sound like Ralph Waldo Emerson. I've been doing some research on Emerson. In fact, I just did a program last week on him. And Emerson addressed himself to the question, what are the purposes of life? He had been a minister at one time, by the way. He left the ministry after about 5 years to become a lecturer and writer. But he said this in answering his question, what are the purposes of life? He said, for myself, I believe the purposes of life are self-examination, self-exploration, self-knowledge, and self-cultivation. Self-knowledge and self-cultivation. The idea is that if we are going to live fulfilling lives, it means we want to continually grow in terms of self-awareness, but also go beyond that to self-cultivation, developing whatever talents we have,
Exactly.
and making whatever kind of contribution we can to society.
Exactly. And you know, you mentioned that about talents we have. As people grow through life, people tell them, you know, what you have to do is developing your weaknesses, and you have to overcome your shortcomings. Well, it's very interesting. Vince Lombardi, I don't know how familiar you are with old Vince.
Very, very well familiar.
But he had a very interesting...
Coach of the Green Bay Packers.
Yes, yes. He had a very interesting perspective. He said, your greatest strengths as a leader are those characteristics that make you unique. And I thought about that. I said, well, that's pretty profound, because usually people tell you you got to go the other way. And when you think about that, you know, each of us is unique. Each of us has certain talents and skills. And should we direct our energies to building the weaknesses we have? Or should we direct our energies towards strengthening our strengths?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that we probably should put more time into strengthening the things we're good at, because the more we're like ourselves, the more natural we are. See, I could not be like you. In other words, and you could not be like me. So each of us has certain talents and skills. So I see myself gaining strength by strengthening what I'm good at.
Yeah.
Sure, we all have shortcomings. That's why we're human. But we could put some energy there. But the main force of our energy should be to just make us stronger.
And so much of the awareness of what our strengths and weaknesses are come from self-examination,
Exactly.
self-exploration.
Exactly.
And I think one of the sad things is that many people, because they don't explore themselves enough, never become well acquainted with their strengths. Howard Gardner at Harvard has done a lot of research on intelligence, and he's come to the conclusion that there are at least 7 main kinds of intelligences. And he said school just generally measures 2 kinds of intelligences, verbal and mathematical. That it's school generally isn't very good at promoting other kinds of intelligences or even valuing other kinds of. So the point I wish to make is if people would engage more in self-exploration, they might find out that even if they didn't do very well in school, they have some real intelligences that they could build on to make their lives much more fulfilling. But again, that requires some self-examination.
Exactly.
And the self-examination, in my opinion, usually requires solitude and silence. I think one of the aspects of our society that I think is hurting people, as I see it, is that it seems to me many people today don't value solitude and silence.
They're afraid of that silence.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the adage, wherever you go, there you are.
Yeah.
And is that good news?
Yeah. I know I love to be alone, and I love quietude, and I find that I do my best thinking at that time.
So do I.
Mozart and Beethoven didn't compose in crowds.
No.
Tolstoy and Dostoevsky did not write their books in crowds.
How could you do that? You have to have that period of withdrawal where you have to go inward and think, and you get those brilliant flashes that come, you know, because you're thinking about something, and maybe at a conscious level you'll forget about it, and then all of a sudden 3, 4, 5 days later, boom, an idea pops and you got to write it down.
I agree with you. The other reason solitude and silence is so valuable, in my view, is that society often confuses us. Other people, even people we love, who are well-meaning, can confuse us about what we should value, what we shouldn't value, how we should live, how we shouldn't live. And that when we are alone with our thoughts, we can better evaluate what others have told us and come to some real conclusions about what we really believe. In contrast to what, this expression I love that you use, in contrast to what designated thinkers claim we should believe and think.
Exactly, because people lack confidence in their own thinking ability, and since they don't go deeply into an issue, they assume that these so-called designated thinkers know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And they're pretty much clueless.
I agree.
I mean,
There's so many people who are looked upon, I think, as experts, are not experts. And if people don't see that, they're going to be taken in by a lot of these people.
I tell my students, when you hear the word expert, run.
Yes.
Because, you know, in today's world, knowledge and information and everything changes, you know, your ability to be an expert is like 15 minutes and then, you know, next.
Yeah. I want to get to another aspect of one of your books. You have a chapter in one of your books entitled, and I love this, Little Bitty Minds Can Travel in Large Groups. And let me just read to the audience a sentence that you wrote that I find pretty profound. Again, these are George's own words. One of the most serious threats to an individual's unique humanity is the misguided desire to move with the crowd. When people do things because of what others have told them they should be doing, they are relinquishing their individuality, their uniqueness. Elaborate on this. We've talked a little bit about it, but elaborate on that.
Well, first of all, I have to explain that that doesn't mean that if everybody stops at red lights, you don't have to stop at red lights because you're going to demonstrate your uniqueness. I mean, we do need to have certain requirements that people need to follow for safety purposes. But I think what happens is, again, related to this idea of people not thinking deeply into an issue, not doing research. We tend to follow the crowd. People kind of want to put their finger in the air to see which way the wind's going and then go with that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the global warming situation. You know, you ask people, how do you feel about global warming? Well, I feel that we need to, do what we need to do to kind of prevent this. Well, that's fine. I said, then you could say to them, well, what do you know about global warming?
Yes.
Well, I don't know that much about it, but I have certain feelings about it. Well, I mean, if global warming, if we were the contributors of global warming, then there should be unproven scientific fact, because science is science. You don't have a consensus on science. You don't have a consensus that the law of gravity exists, right?
Yes, yes.
So people want to feel good, so they'll do something that they think is good for the economy, et cetera, which is fine. But what happens to a lot of the decisions that we make as a nation is they're too short-term focused. Einstein had a great concept. He said the significant problems we face today cannot be at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. And for example, you take a look at the gas situation, the energy situation, the skyrocketing costs. Well, why? Well, the decision was made in '93 not to drill for oil and ANWR. You know, Congress approved it, Clinton vetoed it, and so we didn't drill. So consequently, what happened? We're dependent upon other countries for our energy sources. Then you have the ethanol situation where it was decided by Congress that, you know, a certain percentage of corn oil be put into gasoline to save on the demand for gasoline. Fine. So that was short-term quick fix. What do we find out now? That is more polluting in the environment than gasoline. Plus, the cost of food has skyrocketed around the world because corn has more than doubled in price.
One of the problems I think you're alluding to is that both government and many corporations look to the short term and not the long term.
Yes, exactly.
And many citizens not well informed enough, not thinking deeply enough to realize what's going on.
Right, and then we have the blame game. Well, something happened, we got to find somebody to blame. Well, I blame them. Blame them. This is not our fault. Politicians, not their fault. Somebody else's. Big business.
Yeah.
It's Exxon, it's this, it's that, it's not us. Yeah, but you made the decisions.
One of the things I like very much about, again, your chapter entitled Little Bitty Minds Can Travel in Large Groups, is this, that I think what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the many things you're saying, is the majority is often wrong.
Yes.
And that if one doesn't realize the majority is often wrong, that's going to interfere with one's attempts to live a more fulfilling life. I remember when I was a kid, you probably had the same experience. If we were arguing about something when we were 11 years old, you know, one of the kids might say, well, let's take a vote. Mm-hmm. And the idea was, you know, if most of the kids thought I was wrong or you were wrong, well, then we must be wrong. Mm-hmm. When we know if we examine history, philosophy, psychology, so often it's the people who've been in the minority who have been correct, and it's the majority that's been wrong.
Right.
You know, I'm looking at the clock here, and I see that we're running short of time. I just cannot believe it has gone by so fast. You're going to have to come back for another program, George.
Definitely.
I very much appreciate you coming.
I'm going to have to come on my program, and we can keep this going.
I'd like very much to do that.
Terrific, terrific. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you. As is my custom, I'd like to conclude the program with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, in his masterpiece, Walden, penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the greatest of arts."